Today, I'll share techniques and colors and a formula that you can use to create skin tones in watercolor. We'll use this child as an example, focusing on how to create the skin colors. And if you'd like to learn more about how to paint the hair, the eyes, the mouth, or the jacket, let me know in the comments. My favorite colors in painting people are permanent rose, Windsor blue, and yellow ochre. And why these colors? Permanent rose and Windsor blue are staining colors. That means when dry, the color will mostly stay in place, even when applying further layers over them. And permanent rose and Windsor blue are non-granulating. You won't see any specks when the color dries. You'll have nice, smooth skin. And I use yellow ochre because I like how that color appears when you mix it with permanent rose and Windsor blue, and also when you layer it with those colors. Now let's look at the formula for creating this child. And these are the steps you can use to paint humans. Know what to expect when painting people. Be patient. It will take time, thin layers of color. There will be uncomfortable stages. And when you expect that, you can move forward with confidence. I like to begin with the eyes and often the mouth because this creates the personality. I also find it helpful to lay in the beginnings of the eyebrows, simply where the eyebrows will be so you can keep track of them and they don't get lost. And also the beginnings of the nose and the nostrils to establish the shape of the nose. And we'll return to refine the eyebrows and the nose as we move through the painting. After these features are in place, establish a pale map of colors and the first layer of skin. The idea is to create the beginnings of the hair, the jacket, the skin. And you can begin anywhere, wherever you feel confident. I decided to move into the hair first. I established a pale map of lines and shapes. As we progress through the painting, I'll revisit and refine the hair. Next, I felt more confident moving into the first layers of skin. And here are some tips for success. Take your time and slowly build the color. We're going to layer one color over another. Use very thin consistencies, tea to thin milk. Know that there will be uncomfortable stages. There will be times when it just won't look right. And when you expect this, you can move forward with confidence, knowing that it will all come together. And I'll begin with where it will eventually be the darkest, in the shadow areas, in areas where I'm seeing inward curve. This is a pale gray mix of permanent rose, Windsor blue, and yellow ochre. The consistency is tea to milk. You can apply the color wet in wet or wet on dry. Here, I'm using the wet in wet technique. So dampen that area with water, taking the water further than where you want the color to go. Touch in a bit of color and allow it to spread. Gently thin the edges of the color so it fades into the white of the paper. In smaller areas where you're laying in just a bit of color, apply the color directly to the dry paper. Rinse your brush, wipe it on the towel so it's barely damp, and soften the edges, smoothly transitioning from gray into the white of the paper. By the end of this step, it's going to appear uncomfortable, but keep moving forward and trust the process. And next, we'll create the beginnings of the skin color. I find it helpful to begin with the colors underneath the main skin tone. So this skin is kind of tan with maybe a hint of pink in it. But we can also see pinks and blues and purples and sometimes greens and tans and browns. And I'm going to get those colors in first. I tend to begin in areas that contain pink. Very thin consistency, like tea to thin milk. You often see pink around the eyes. Here, in this smaller shape, I'm laying in the color wet on dry and softening the edges. You'll see pinks in the cheeks. It's often pinkish around the nostrils and around the mouth, in the chin. In most of these areas, I'm laying in the color wet on dry because I'm creating small shapes and I'm softening the edges. But you could definitely dampen an area and lay in the color wet in wet, whatever you're comfortable with. Between each layer of color, you want to dry completely, and I use a hair dryer to do that. Next, look for pale blues or purples or greens. You often see these colors around the mouth and the eyes. The consistency is so thin, like water to tea. It makes a slight difference in the color. And as you progress through the painting, you'll be revisiting these colors. If you're not sure what to do next, it's helpful to lay in the first layer of the overall skin tone. This is a pale pinkish tan mix of permanent rose and yellow ochre, the consistency of water to very thin milk. I'm laying in the color wet on dry, but if this was a larger painting, I would dampen first with plain water and then lay in the color. Adjust the amount of yellow or pink in the mix based on what you see. And you see how that is smoothing and it's unifying everything? And we've got our first layer of skin in place. Next, I established a pale map of what will be the colors in the jacket. And I'll return to the jacket as we progress through the painting. The first pale layers of color are in place everywhere and will serve as a guide as we now begin to go darker and refine color. I return to the hair and refine the eyebrows. And getting those darker values in place will help us decide how to further refine the skin. And we're going to repeat the process. Just do what we did before. So first, the pinks, the blues and purples, and the browns underneath the main skin tone. We'll start with the pinks again. Ask yourself, where would I like to see a little more pink? Use thin layers of that pinkish mix. This is the mix of permanent rose with a little yellow ochre. Consistency is tea to very thin milk. And keep it pale so you're seeing just a hint of color. It might be the nose, the chin, the cheeks. I'm applying color wet on dry and softening edges, but wet in wet would work too. Really, whatever works for you. Next, ask yourself, would you like to refine areas that contain blue or purple? I'm using Windsor blue, and it's a strong color, so I keep it very thin like water to tea. You want to see just a hint of this color. If you'd like your subject to have a bit of a tan, apply pale brown or a brown mix of those colors. Wet on dry or wet in wet, very thin. The color will appear different on the paper due to all those previous layers underneath. Look for the lightest parts. Where would you like the lightest parts to be? Apply the color around and soften into those lightest parts, anywhere that you want to see a tan or a brown color. You could also use burnt umber or burnt sienna, very pale. These thin layers of color are making subtle differences, which in the end create an interesting, rich skin tone. At any time when you feel that things are appearing rough, smooth with plain water and your damp brush, begin with a slightly damp brush. If you don't see a difference, use more water on your brush. And because we're using permanent rose and Windsor blue, which are staining, you can slightly smooth, but those colors will mostly stay in place. I returned to the hair and refined the color, created the impression of overlapping hair and shadow. After going darker in the hair, you might find that once again the skin has become too pale, or there might be parts of skin color that you wish to refine. Revisit the colors underneath. Would you like to see any pink anywhere, any more blues, purples, or tans. I'm applying the color wet on dry and softening edges, but you could go in wet. I began with the pinks, then a tan brown mix of permanent rose, Windsor blue, and yellow ochre. This is wet on dry, but it might have been better to go in wet because I'm seeing a splotch. Do you see that little mark? But it is fixable. I'll show you what to do in a moment. I'll refine the blue below the eyes, and it's very thin. And here's what you can do if you see splotches or unevenness. Smooth with plain water and your damp brush. Begin with a slightly damp brush. If you don't see a difference, use more water on your brush. When you use a gentle touch, you can smooth without lifting color. When completely dry, I find that a thin layer of yellow ochre does wonders to the skin tone. It changes the character of the colors. And I like how yellow ochre looks when you layer it with permanent rose and Windsor blue. A very thin consistency, like water to tea. Apply the color wet in wet or wet on dry. Finally, when your skin tones are in place, return to the eyebrows. Create eyelashes and refine the eyes for that final touch of personality. I made final refinements to the mouth and returned for one more look at the skin. Here, I'm laying in the color wet in wet, dampening first with water and then touching in a tan brown color. Make final refinements to the jacket and the hair. Once again, you could use your damp brush and plain water to smooth and unify. And when you're happy with your painting, it's finished. Be patient. Trust the process and have fun. If you'd like to see the full tutorial in real time, I invite you to visit our online school. I hope you found this video helpful and applicable to your own paintings. Thanks for watching.